During Vietnam War protests, people burned down their draft cards. Let's say this demonstration would have been put down. Would have this been a violation of free speech? Would it also be a violation of free speech if they burned these cards in a match factory? We'll be talking about the internet's favorite subject, free speech. First, we need to recognize the difference between the morality of free speech and the lawfulness of free speech. You might say and think that it's totally moral to just say that you don't like cola. But if Big Cola decides that you can't say these things anymore and puts it into legislation, this would become unlawful. I'll be making different arguments for either one, but I'll try to stick mostly to the moral one, as I find these the most interesting. If you see free speech as a fundamental human right, and therefore everyone should have free speech, that's a liberal value, and that would make you a liberal in this aspect. Because free speech is a basic human right, therefore it is moral to have free speech, because it is a human right, and therefore everyone should have free speech, because it's moral. This appeal to morality isn't totally final, because you could also say that hate speech is immoral, but it might still have to be secured because of fear that the government would abuse the power of being able to censor things. Someone who only looks at the consequences of actions sees that free speech brings about the best results and therefore is an advocate of free speech. So they believe when you are able to speak freely with each other, this comes eventually with the best result. This would not necessarily need a democracy, but it is seen as pretty conducive to it. A fun idea related to this is the marketplace of ideas. It basically postulates that if you just let everyone say whatever they want, eventually the best ideas will come out on top. Something which I found really interesting is that ideas might have been subject to evolution. This is basically a derivative of Richard Dawkins and his idea of the meme, basically that information is also going through evolution. In order for evolution to occur, there have to be a couple things in place so it can actually happen. These things are a lack of resources, competition, heritability, and mutation. Competition is present among ideas, since different ideas compete about which one is better. Lack of resources is also present with ideas, because we can't hold all of the ideas in our head, so the resource that is scarce becomes our bandwidth, so to say. Heritability is also present, because ideas are passed down from person to person to person, like how genes are passed down from parents to offspring. Mutation occurs because there are little differences, because when I tell you an idea, you might interpret it a little different, so every time I spread an idea and it reproduces, it mutates a little, it differs a little from the original. This would mean that the most adaptive ideas are proliferating. That marketplace of ideas doesn't really work in my opinion, because it doesn't select for truth, rather for adaptability. For the next point, you have to agree with two things. First, democracy is good, and second, free speech is a key characteristic of a democracy. If free speech is one of the pillars of democracy, and it would get removed, then the democracy would no longer be in place. Therefore, we need free speech in order to preserve a good thing. Free speech might develop and allow for more thought when speaking about something. I really like this one book that perfectly illustrates this whole idea. George Orwell argued in 1984 that language is essential for thinking. In this book, George Orwell basically describes a totalitarian state which cracks down wholly on free speech. Lots of other things, but also free speech, and that's relevant for this. Basically, there can't be any books, there can't be any monologuing, so you can't really talk to yourself, otherwise the secret police will get you. And you aren't allowed to criticize the party, and you can't really speak freely, basically. Only when Winston, the main character, is able to illegally get a book and write in it, his thought and his mind really opens up for new thoughts. So when he's able to use language freely, he's able to start to think freely. In addition to this, the government in 1984 tries to implement a new sort of language called Newspeak, and this is a very restrictive language in order for the people not to be able to really think outside of the language that they have been provided. In order to form thoughts properly, one might need to be able to use language freely, so to speak freely through the freedom of speech. This language use might be monological, so you writing in a journal, or dialectical, so you talking with your friends. And even if you're for banning hate speech or threats or whatever, would you also be in favor of banning this when there is a monological use, so just writing it down in a journal? When seeing language as a tool to develop yourself and developing ideas, this also says that you can't use any compelled speech. Things like the forced pledges in American schools would be banned, since these interfere with the free flow of thought. Another fun idea is that it might just be training for liberal values. When being able to tolerate Nazis and hate speech, this would train our liberal values in order to make our political system function better. By not training these values, we might fall victim to wanting to suppress the ones that we disagree with, and thus weakening our political system, since it would be illiberal and would therefore be harmful to our system. I can understand if this is vague, so we'll do a little story time. First, imagine Anne. She feels that she is a staunch liberal. All her life there have been Nazi rallies and communist rallies at times of unrest. She doesn't really like either side and gets uncomfortable when they occur. Although she doesn't like them, she tolerates it, since she feels everyone should be able to express themselves. She comes across a boy at her school who is rude to her and possibly sexist. She expresses her disdain for him, but does nothing else. Now imagine Ashley. She feels that she's a staunch liberal. After a couple of Nazi and communist rallies, these have been banned in her country. She doesn't like either side and is glad that they got suppressed. She comes across a boy who is very rude to her and possibly sexist. She gets very mad at him and goes to the principal to expel the boy. Which one of these stories seems to set up for a more liberal democracy in the future? The story of Anne or the story of Ashley? One of the biggest problems with passing legislation that interferes with free speech is that it is seen as a slippery slope. When allowing a government to restrict speech, they might use this to suppress opponents and thus harming the system. But we do allow for some restriction of free speech, for example, noise curfews. Why do we allow some of the restrictions but not others? Absolute free speech is something we generally don't want. Almost everyone agrees to this, since it would allow for bribery, threatening, and hate speech, or things like that. A balanced approach recognizes the conflict between free speech values and external moral values. This way, the right to free speech has to be balanced with other people's rights. For example, you can't just call a group of people inferior, since it would undermine their standing in their community and defaming them. This would infringe upon their values and their rights. You might have to balance the right to freedom of speech to the other person's right who opposes your free speech. Another approach emphasizes the eternal moral values. Paradoxically, this would mean that you advocating for free speech would result in you restricting free speech. Let me explain. This would happen when the underlying values of free speech align more with the restriction of free speech. For example, you might be pro-free speech because everyone has the right to be autonomous. But being bombarded by false information might restrict one's autonomy. Let's say if a foreign country, let's say to the east of Europe, and let's call it Russia, would send loads of bots on a social media platform, let's say Z, would it be okay to remove the infringement upon people's autonomy by restricting the free speech? Since these bots misinform the people on this platform and therefore infringe upon their right to autonomy. Okay, and now let's say that you agreed earlier that democracy was good and that free speech was a key aspect of a democracy. Seems pretty valid, right? What if a democratic country decides to ban free speech? Would you refuse to vote and thus becoming anti-democratic? Or would you accept the vote? and thus becoming anti-democratic. Would this free speech not create a self-destruct mechanism within a democracy, and thus therefore becoming itself undemocratic? Okay, so let's say that we agree that it needs to be proportionate with the amount of harm and amount of good that is done by free speech. Here we have a distinction that is narrowly proportionate and widely proportionate. Narrowly proportionate is only done to the person that you're talking to, so just your friend or whatever. We won't tell our friend to shut up when he is a little bit loud, when he cries about his mom dying, because the harm it would do to exercise your free speech would not benefit the good that it would bring. Wide proportionate means that it includes everything besides the person that you're talking to, so everything within the society. And this becomes a bit muddy and hard to measure. It's very hard to legislate wide proportionate harm because it's very vague and it's very context dependent, and you can't really measure it. When, for example, people don't want to use pronouns, how does this relate to everyone within a society? Is this just hurting the person that you say it to, or everyone outside of it? And how do you measure it? And you can't really know how much it hurts the society, that is. One person you could ask, obviously, but you don't know how many people are affected. Free speech remains to be one of the trickiest and the hardest things to regulate and determine the morality of, probably because of the inherent subjectivity of it all. In protecting democracy, putting down the influence of bad actors while preserving all of the rights of the citizens is essential. Luckily, I'm not the one given this impossible task. It might signal a fundamental problem in our system, or it might just be another problem for our superior system to solve. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and a huge shout out to the Stanford Encyclopedia. I love you guys for giving such quality info and so condensed for everyone to read and just being free. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and have a good day.